Hi, Tony DeWitt here. I am a Missouri appellate attorney, and I like to make the law make sense here on YouTube. Today we're going to talk about a confusing legal concept called jurisdiction. More on that in just a moment. The word jurisdiction is bandied about with quite a bit of disregard for its actual meaning. In terms of the law, what jurisdiction means is the power of a court to decide a case. There are several different kinds of jurisdiction. There is subject matter jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, and Inrim jurisdiction. And we'll get to all of those here in just a moment. But let's start with the issue of subject matter jurisdiction. As I've mentioned on here before, there are federal and state courts. And federal and state courts often hear many of the same types of cases. But the jurisdiction to hear those cases is determined by statute, at least with respect to the federal law. The federal courts have subject matter jurisdiction, in other words, jurisdiction over the type of case, in two distinct areas. The first of those is federal question jurisdiction. So, for example, if someone decides to sue a business under the antitrust statute, the Clayton Act, then that is a federal question. You can bring the suit in state court. However, it will be removed to federal court because it presents a federal question. Specifically, the federal question it presents is, how does the antitrust statute apply to the facts of that case? So that's federal question jurisdiction. If you wanted to sue under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act or the Civil Rights Act, all of those are federal statutes that grant a right of relief to individuals. And in those situations, the subject matter jurisdiction is proper in the federal courts. What the second level of jurisdiction, subject matter jurisdiction in the federal courts, is diversity jurisdiction. Diversity jurisdiction means that you have a plaintiff and a defendant from different states. Now, the law requires complete diversity. But basically, if Joe in Missouri decides to sue Phil in Illinois, there's diversity of jurisdiction. However, if Phil was involved with Pete, and Pete is part of the scheme under which Joe wants to sue, and Pete lives in Missouri, that would not be complete diversity. And as a result, the case would properly be in state court. It could be in state court in either Missouri or Illinois, subject to issues of personal jurisdiction, which we'll discuss in just a moment. In addition to being citizens of different states, there has to be an amount in controversy that is greater than $75,000. What that means is if Phil drives his truck into Missouri and hits a car in Missouri, that the damages to the people and property have to exceed $75,000 in order for that case to be removable to federal court, because then it would be removed under the basis of what is called diversity jurisdiction with damages in excess of $75,000. So you have to have two things to get diversity jurisdiction: complete diversity of the parties and damages in excess of $75,000. So what is complete diversity? Complete diversity means that if somebody else was involved, let's say, for example, that someone was working in the road and the boom of their truck stuck out as such that when Phil went around that, he hit the other car, then the person who was operating the equipment that had its boom out in the road might also be negligent. And if Joe sued both Phil and the other operator, then there would not be complete diversity of jurisdiction or complete diversity of citizenship, and diversity jurisdiction wouldn't apply. However, there is a doctrine called pretensive joinder. And pretensive joinder simply means if you name somebody else that really doesn't have liability, just because they happen to reside in that state, that the court can disregard that party for the purposes of its jurisdictional analysis. And that's usually a fact-driven analysis. Now that is subject matter jurisdiction in the federal courts. State courts have general subject matter jurisdiction over pretty much everything that happens in their state, unless a federal statute grants exclusive jurisdiction to a federal court. What kind of statute does that? Well, for example, the Federal Tort Claims Act. If you sue the United States government for something that the United States government does, it can only be brought in a federal court. If you have a vaccine injury, if you are injured, for example, by the mumps vaccine or the measles vaccine, and you bring an action under the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Act, that can only be heard by statute in the Federal Court of Claims. So there are certain things where subject matter jurisdiction is, by statute, limited to certain places. Those are almost always a federal statute. So let's now talk about personal jurisdiction. Personal jurisdiction is a difficult concept, and it continues to evolve to this day. But personal jurisdiction looks at whether it is fair to exercise jurisdiction over an individual based on what relationship they have to the court where the action is being tried and the state where the action is being tried. So, for example, Wes owns an airplane, and as part of owning that airplane, he leases it to someone else. We'll call him Jim. Jim flies down to Texas and gets aviation gasoline for the plane, flies off, and doesn't pay the vendor. Under Texas law, it's possible for that vendor to have a lien on the aircraft, and he might sue in Texas to enforce that lien. He would have to sue Wes because Wes owns the airplane. So when Wes is served with the lawsuit and he lives in Missouri, he can say, I have no contacts with Texas. It's not fair for me and my airplane to be hailed into court in Texas because of something someone else did. I don't have any connections to the forum. And indeed, in at least one case, that's exactly what happened. The court said, you're right, there's no personal jurisdiction. Personal jurisdiction depends on minimum contacts sufficient to satisfy due process. And the way that you satisfy due process is it has to be fair, based on all the circumstances, to litigate the case in that jurisdiction. Now, we've talked about the difference between state and federal courts and personal and subject matter jurisdiction, and I want to distinguish that from something that is related but different, and that is venue. Venue has to do with where in a particular state an action may be tried. In Missouri, for example, which I happen to know quite a bit about, the law has changed such that venue is only proper where the injury arose in a tort lawsuit. So if someone is driving through Callaway County and gets injured there by someone who lives in St. Louis City, the lawyer can't sue the person in St. Louis City. He has to sue them where the injury occurred. And as a result of that, that is where the venue is in a state court action. Venue is different from jurisdiction. All of the state courts would have jurisdiction to hear that case, but venue is only going to be proper in the location where the statute says that it would be proper. Another form of jurisdiction is called Inrim Jurisdiction, and that is jurisdiction over the property. One of the primary ways that jurisdiction becomes, or Inrim Jurisdiction arises, is by virtue of where a particular piece of property is located. And this can be both real property as well as personal property. So, for example, recently there has been a case where the FBI seized a building because they believed that the people who owned the building, the private vault corporation, was engaged in criminal conduct. Well, a lot of individuals had their documents and money and valuables stored in these private vaults. And as a result of having those things stored there because they wanted to keep them safe, the government filed motions to seize that property as the proceeds of crime. Unfortunately for the government, they didn't include any allegations specific to those individuals that those elements were effectively elements that came from a crime. So while the court had in-rim jurisdiction over the actual property, it didn't have subject matter jurisdiction because it did not, the notice of forfeiture did not set out the actual elements that would have made it proper for the court to exercise jurisdiction over the people. As you can see, jurisdiction is a very confusing and very difficult area of the law. It gives law students migraine headaches. It gives lawyers migraine headaches, and it even gives judges migraine headaches. As a result, it's not something that you should simply assume you have anytime you have a lawsuit against someone. It's something that has to be decided, and jurisdiction often plays into the value of a case. The jurisdiction of a case in federal court may be less or maybe more, depending on what state you're in, than litigation in a state court. Thank you so much for watching, and have a terrific day. Also, if you think of it, I'd really appreciate it if you would smash the like button for me and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Again, thank you for watching, and have a terrific day.